Oh, okay. This meeting is being okay. So it's recording now. Let's try this again. All right, cool. So, like I was saying, so basically, the topic is the cycle of violence, and when I read the paper, I was so confused by how little was in the introduction itself. It had a good amount of information, however, I felt like there wasn't enough, and it wasn't really explaining why it's called the cycle of violence, why how it came to be, etc., and things like that. So I decided to look more into it, and I discovered that the cycle of violence was a theory that was founded by Lenore Walker in 1979 when she was interviewing and doing studies on sorry, on battered women syndrome. And out of the study, not only did she create the cycle of violence, she also created learned helplessness theory. But when you're trying to understand the cycle of violence, a lot of people have a hard time realizing that it's not just someone who's dealing with something and they don't have a choice. It's they're not realizing it because of how much denial they're in when they're in the situation. So basically, there's three components to the cycle of violence. I consider there to be four, but technically, when you look it up, there's three. There's tension building phase, there's acute explosion or acute crisis phase, and then there's the honeymoon phase. It typically always starts on the honeymoon phase because of the fact that that's when either you get into a relationship or as you're growing up as a child who's being abused, everything's fine. One day, everything's working well. You're the happiest kid alive. Your mom's happy with you. Your dad's happy with you. And then there's small amount of tension that's slowly building up that you're not realizing. And it could just be like you make a mistake and then your mom's always mad at you or your spouse is always mad at you. And they'll start with like small, simple name calling and things like that. And then it comes to the acute or crisis phase where it explodes and it tends to get violent. And that's where the abuse comes in for kids and for just women or men in general that are in, sorry, I speak fast when I'm nervous, that are in this type of situation. And then afterwards is the whole I'm sorry phase, as I like to call it, or the makeup phase, where they're like, oh, it'll never happen again. I'm sorry, da da da. Or in some cases, they buy you things to say basically, I'm sorry, this is my way of showing you love. And it starts all over again. So there's that, right? And if you look at this diagram, it tells you about what the victim's response is and what the batterer is typically ends up doing in this while it's continuously just going around a thing of denial because they don't want to admit what's going on within it. Anyway, so when children are exposed to this violence, they learn how to either resolve their own conflicts or they end up resolving it in a decent manner or they end up doing it in a violent manner. Others tend to desensitize where they just ignore any type of pain that they're in, or they tend to just ignore everybody else. And then, which also ends up leading them to retreat into a shell and avoiding people around them. So they tend to be loners or they tend to just stay by themselves because they're either afraid of speaking out because of whatever's going on at home, or they're afraid to open up to someone because they're going to continuously keep doing what's already being done. So when this happens for a kid, it usually leads to a couple of these things, or it could lead to all of these things, which is behavioral, psychological, and physical problems, where if the abuse is so severe, it can cause stunt growth, like it could stop the growth of a child. It could also just have deformations in them because of the fact they don't typically end up going to the hospital because their parents don't, for lack of a better word, give a crap about them. And so they have fractures that are not healed properly or things like that. Their behavioral issues is typically violent outbursts, or they typically just don't speak. And psychological issues is, well, as we all know, when you're going through any type of abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, your brain chemistry starts to react differently. It needs to if it needs to figure out a way to cope, then with coping, it then figures out a way to protect yourself. And sadly, not always it's the best way. which then leads you to either A, if when it's a kid and they're in school, it leads to them failing because that's one way, that's the one thing that they're not able to control because they're thinking about too many different things. Or they lead to substance or alcohol abuse because it's something that helps releases the pain that they're feeling. Delinquent acts is when there's violence going on in the home, and the only way they know how to project what they're feeling is doing something violent, and that's not best for them, which then causes them to go to juvie and just get arrested and have a arrest record for no reason, which then also leads to adult criminality. And if they end up repeating these things as adults, the violent acts that they've gone through, it will just continuously just go on to it's a cycle that never ends, and it ends up going to their kids and their kids afterwards. So that's the introduction to the topic as far as I could say. Now we're going to go into methods.
Okay, so some of the methods that I found within the journal article, these were the ones that stuck out to me the most because I feel as though as a society, we have to know when it's time to recognize those patterns that you may see in a child when something isn't right. Because, like, so for example, when a child goes to school and they aren't, oh, okay. When a child goes to school and they aren't, what's the word? They aren't, what is the word? I'm trying to think.
Well, what are you trying to, like, what exactly are you trying to
Their
say?
own like their performance level isn't where it should
Oh,
be.
their academic report.
Yeah. Okay. So their academic levels, their behavioral issues, things like that can all go into reasons why you should look into a certain situation, why you should look into that home situation or what that child may be going through outside of school. So there's the first one is called multi-system therapy, basically where clinicians, they meet with the child multiple times a week and the family, so that way they can kind of get into that better relationship kind of thing. So if there's a family who has been struggling with abuse, okay, so say for like example, there is an abusive father in a home, and there's children, there's the mother, and they're all trying to work on it. So they've already established that there's an issue. They've already established that they do need to go through things in order to be better as a family, and that way they can correct different relationships with different people outside of the family. So that I think that is very positive for them to do. And then there's another one called trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Basically, so if someone has been going through trauma as a child, this will help the parent communicate better with the child, so that way they can open up, because as we all know, if you keep things in, it's harder to express yourself. So if you can't express yourself as a child, most likely you're not going to be able to express yourself as an adult, and those things do carry on. So with that, you want to catch it early. It also focuses on behavioral responses to gradual trauma, meaning that so if they've been experiencing certain trauma or abuse or neglect or anything like that since they were an infant, they'll understand why the child is acting the way they are once they've gotten to a specific age. Cognitive behavioral intervention basically kind of is incorporated into the school system. And I think this is very, very important, because not every parent believes that there may be something wrong with their child. So if there are school officials who decide to get into the situation and they decide to start talking, it can actually help the child, whether because, like she said, denial is a big thing. So there are a lot of issues that come along with the cycle, being that they think that there's nothing wrong. So we would want the children to be able to realize the patterns that they are experiencing, so that way they don't continue it into their adult lives, because that's when psychological issues can in fact overwhelm the person or the child. So yeah, you can go to the next slide.
Okay, once I figure out why my screen is being weird. Okay, got it. Cool.
Okay, so mine is on the theories. The cycle of violence is presented with different theories that include how a child's future may be affected by the violence that he or she experiences at home. So there's 3 different theories. The most common theory is believed to be the social learning theory. This theory indicates that children study the behavior that their parents or caregivers display to them. If the parents or caregivers scream, fight, or abuse others, children mirror this behavior because the parents and caregivers are prime influencers in the child's life. The child believes that this behavior is appropriate and physical punishment is problematic because a study shows where children were spanked as a form of discipline, the child incorporated the strategy and used it to resolve conflicts with siblings or peers. Another theory is the attachment theory. It plays a big role in the cycle of violence. Some children who develop violent behavior most likely grew up in an abusive household. When a baby is born, a bond should be formed between the baby and the caregiver, and it is called attachment. Attachment is getting primary needs met, such as love and nurture. Attachment becomes the engine of social, emotional, and cognitive development. Any type of rejection from the primary caregiver or parent will disrupt attachment and lead for the child to have a negative outlook on life. This negative pattern and view on life, school, and peers can be taken to adult life, which will create a cycle of violence when they have children of their own. Another type of theory is social information processing. It suggests that severe physical harm before the age of 5 leads to aggression and violence. The child will struggle because the child will view harmless interactions as unfriendly or harmful. The child will respond to situations and interactions with aggression. This will affect the child's social life with peers and teachers. So that's the end.
Theories. Hold on, I have to do something to my screen because it's not letting my mouse work. I apologize for the inconvenience, people. Okay, there we go. Did Emily come back yet or no?
Yeah, I'm here.
Cool.
Okay, so when it comes to connecting the article to the book, it wasn't easy as before because I couldn't connect it to any specific chapter. Reading all the chapters, I was able to connect it to almost all of the chapters, and we can see how violence can affect the everyone, not just the person that the victim. It can affect everybody around them. For example, in chapter 3, we get to know Eugenia's story, and on page 48, we learn that her mother was abused as a child, and she probably is in an abusive relationship with Eugenia's father. At the time that she left her at the orphanage, she was only like 8 months. So I really like the story because I feel like it proves the attachment theory, how, you know, growing, like if you grew up in that environment, maybe if her mother wouldn't have left her like at the orphanage at the early age, she probably would have ended up like her mother as well. So in some way, based on her mother, you can see that violence at the end does breed violence. Also in chapter 9, we get to learn of Terrell's story. He grew up in a really toxic environment. His father was not around. His mother was abusive. They were like drug addicts, I believe, and they were in gangs. So at a young age, his empathy, his everything, his attachment. He didn't have attachment to nobody, and he didn't have a role model. Can you guys hear me? Oh yeah. So that affecting him in a way that he ended up being violent at a young age. Like when the chapter started, he was only 12. In the last chapter that I was able to connect it to was chapter 7, which is, out of all the chapters in the book, it was my favorite one, because it shows that not everybody that grows up in a violent environment has to end up being violent. I believe that everybody that has a support system or has someone there to guide them to the right path, they're able to not fall into a statistic like Trinity did. She did try to help her sisters and brothers. She did try to be there for everybody, but unfortunately, because her mother and her dad wasn't able to be there, but unfortunately they did ended up falling into a statistic, not her. So I like how they added that chapter in there, because if you read all the other chapters, everything is like really how they were unable to get attachment, how they were unable to develop empathy, and how in the end violence affected their empathy and attachment. um so yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. So when reading this, I looked at the research and I got very irritated with the research. I was on the phone with a friend talking about it, and when you look at the research, let's say, just for example, so it starts on page 31 of the research where it says research findings on the cycle of violence. I started reading it, and it's first just tells you about the percentage of male offenders, which are typically between the ages, which is unknown ages. It's all typically just saying they reported histories of physical or sexual abuse before the age of 18. And for women, it was 23 to 37% offenders who reported that they were physically or sexually abused before the age of 18. Okay. No one's talking to you. Sorry. And then when you go into more of the research, which then like perspective studies linking childhood abuse and neglect to violence in adulthood, which is on the following page, page 32, there was 5 large perspective studies in the U.S. And the more you read about it, none of their ages were very much alike, except for what? I think it was one of them, where most of the case studies were around a similar age, but none of them had either similar raisings. None of them had very much coexisting similarities. So it's just like, how can you say that that these kids are at risk for being violent, or these kids are at risk for ending up in jail, when their stories, their backgrounds are all different? Just because they grew up in either a badly treated home or a slightly abusive home or an extremely abusive home doesn't mean that at certain ages they're going to end up in jail. But that's what most of the studies were. They were most of these studies, they followed the kid for about 25 years and and came up with percentages on how likely they were to either end up in jail by the age of 17 or as an adult. For example, the third study that was done, which was done in Rochester, New York, they followed young urban youth that were from the ages of 14 to their adulthood, and they got their records of abuse and neglect from the social services department, and they compared their records to kids who didn't have any abuse or neglect at home. And so just because of the fact that the kids that didn't have abuse, they were 38.6% less likely to be put in jail, whereas 23.7% were more likely to be put in jail if they had a bad way of growing up. So when I just kept looking at the results, I kept getting frustrated, because I was just like, you can't only judge them based off of their backgrounds and everything. But then when you look into the genetic study, and they were testing all these kids and looking at the genetic research on the cycle of violence, and if there's possible anger issues, or just basically growing up in a violent type household, it showed that it's not, that their genes don't have a main effect on the way that they're going to grow up into either being in a cycle of violence or being within a cycle of violence, because it's not just what you have within your DNA, it's also what's going on around you. And that's what people forget. It's not just because of the fact that in your household it's not great, that it's also the people that you decide to surround yourself with and the environment you grew up in. So like, I don't know how to say this without completely, for example, I could throw myself into this ring. I am a person who grew up in a cycle of violence. I grew up in an abusive household. I was raised by other people that were my father's sister, and she was abusive towards me. And even though I grew up in that household, and I know that there are certain tendencies where I know that I could be either a little bit violent or I could be a little bit aggressive. But if it wasn't for the people I decided to surround myself around, if it wasn't for the friends that I made, whether it was growing up in middle school or in high school alone, or trying to figure out ways to get out of the house by working, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I wouldn't be able to help everyone else that I try to help whenever they're feeling down about something. I can't fully rely on people, but I'm learning how to, because I'm realizing that not everybody's out to hurt me. That cycle of denial and that cycle of going continuously of abuse, I've learned how to get out of it. And it took years. It took 5 years for me to do it, but it works. It's capable. I'm not what they consider a statistic where I ended up in juvie. I got arrested. I didn't do drugs. I didn't do things like that. I just stayed quiet and I dealt with it my own way. And I've learned how to handle heavy amounts of stress. I've learned how to deal with situations that a lot of kids shouldn't be put into. And it hurts that people don't realize it, but whenever you look at someone who's been abused or is going through this abuse, people constantly end up looking at them like, why would you let yourself go through that? Why don't you just leave? It's not that easy when you think that's all you have. So my conclusion with this research was that abuse and neglect in childhood and the consequences from it remain an ongoing issue with confronting societal problems. And sadly, it involves millions of children, leading to injury, death, and untold emotional scarring, because no one wants to talk about this horrific topic because it's scary and it's sad, and so people don't want to listen to it. Childhood victimization and its connection to delinquency and crime and violent criminal behavior justifies the constant concern that public should have, and a good portion of it does have now, but there wasn't any concern for it before. And teachers, social workers, law enforcement, mental health, and healthcare workers that serve the youth that carry a crucial role in recognizing the signs and abusive neglect, and then them engaging into serious attempts to intervene as early as possible is all that you could hope for in these stages. And we go on to the next slide. So one of the questions that we were asked was, will survivors of abuse become criminals? And I personally believe it's a 50-50 shot. You can't say yes and you can't say no, because in reality, it all depends on two different things. It depends on what's going on in your household and how you were raised, and it also depends on what environmental factors you have. And then if you really want to add more to it, it also includes peer pressure and the people that you decide to become friends with, because if you have if three of these things are bad outcomes, you have bad influence on the outside, if you have an environment where it's not great on the outside, where there's gangs and drug abuse and all these things, and then in the household it's also these things, 9 times out of 10, sadly to say, you will end up doing victims of abuse will end up becoming criminals. However, if, let's say, it's a child who's being abused, they're in a decent neighborhood and they have decent friends, it's maybe 3 times out of 10 that they end up doing something criminal. Or if it's just abuse in the household and crappy friends and a great environment, it's a 50-50 shot there again as well. Because just because your friends are doing bad things, if you know right and wrong and you understand what you need to do to better yourself, you're not going to listen to what your friends do, because you're trying to get out of that environment. So just because a victim or an individual of abuse doesn't constitute that they will perform some type of criminal activity. Typically, people who engage in criminal activity were exposed to criminal environment and developed around a high criminal influence. So, for example, like I live in Jersey City, and I've watched in the projects or the ghettos, the ghetto area, which is more that way. I've watched people clap and cheer when a 17-year-old got arrested for, I believe it was a shooting. I'm not 100% sure. It was a couple of years ago. And they were clapping for that person, that he got arrested because now he's in the system and he's going into jail and he's going to be doing great. And it was confusing because it's just like, how can you applaud something like that? You're supposed to want them to get out. You're supposed to want them to do better for themselves. But sometimes when you're in that type of environment, people don't want you to do better for yourself because of the fact that they couldn't do better for themselves. So they want you to be in the same boat as them, which is why like people who have gone through this or people who are going through this need to surround themselves by better people and be very cautious of the people that they call their friends. I don't know whose slide this was. Whose slide was this?
It's mine.
Okay.
Okay. So, my question that I decided to take was, how can we break the cycle of violence? And I think it is very important for us as a society to know what normal is. And I say that with a lot of emphasis because people who are typically in these violent situations, they sometimes think that it is normal for them to feel that way. It is normal for them to go through those things because that's all that they are. That's all that they can see. So, for example, girls who watch their fathers abuse their mothers, they may grow up and believe that it is okay to do so. They may think that that it is okay. Like, so, for example, when they get older, they may look for a man who does the same thing, and they won't know, like, okay, well, like, you know, this just means that they love me. Like, this just means that it's okay for this to happen because they've become accustomed to seeing it. I feel like children should also be able to recognize the patterns that are unhealthy and healthy in their lifestyles. So by this, I would just say that everybody just needs to be educated. You won't know if something is normal or healthy or unhealthy if you've never been educated on it or if you've never been exposed to that type of situation. I feel like if these topics are incorporated into the education system, that it can really help it can help end the cycle of violence. I also believe that within this type of topic, it, like you said, it's a 50-50 thing because you never really know how someone can react to a situation. I've also had family members who have been in this cycle of violence for a long time. So for example, like my mom grew up with, you know, violence in her life, you know, living in those types of areas, just being a product of her environment. And she kind of just went the opposite way. She doesn't believe in any of the things that she's seen growing up. So like her raising her kids, her raising my siblings and I, it's completely different for us. So like, it honestly just depends on how you're going to take it and how you reflect and how you take those experiences that you have went through and, you know, learn from it. Because a lot of people, they do tend to say, okay, well, you know, this happened to me, so I'm going to think that it's okay. So for another example would be if a boy grows up and he's watching his father do those abusive things to his mother or his sister or even him, he's going to grow up and do those same things to his children. It's not 100%, but it's very likely that he can do so because he'll believe that it is okay for that to happen. And that is because he's uneducated. He doesn't know what healthy and unhealthy is, what's the difference between the two, and what is actually normal and what isn't normal. So I feel like as a society, our best bet would be to educate everybody, not just the parents, not just, you know, older people, but younger children as well, so they know, okay, well, look, this isn't what I deserve. I deserve better, and that I should know that this isn't right. I don't think that I'll benefit from these things, and if they don't benefit from it, then they shouldn't be in those situations. And it is unfortunate that people do get put into these systems, and it's kind of hard to get out, because if you're exposed to the system early on, it's very likely for you to be a continual offender. It's very likely for you to continuously either go to juvie, and then after juvie, obviously, like, people, they tend to get put into an actual facility. So I just feel like it is, like she's saying in the chat right now, it's very crucial that healthy relationships are being promoted in every which way. So as far as friendships, as far as intimate relationships, as far as your family relationships, things like that, I think that's very important. But yeah, you can go to the next slide now.
The next slide is just our questions, guys. So my question to you guys would be, can you distinguish the difference between abuse and what would be considered tough love, which is basically disciplining your kids?
So Claire, thank you so much, guys, for the presentation. Yay, you guys did your first online presentation. I'm wondering, should we take your questions and split the students in groups so everybody can really chip in? Because I'm just worried with 20 plus participants online, it might get a little bit difficult.
How do we do that in groups?
I need to put you into groups, break you up into groups.
Okay,
so what is your question? Which question should everybody discuss?
Guys?
So we only have to pick one?
Couple of questions that you would like the groups to discuss, and then we'll come back and have a bigger class discussion.
Well, we have 4 questions, so I guess it can be like 4 big groups.
4 groups?
Mm-hmm.
How many people are in here?
The computer will do that for us. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Automatically. I'm not going to count. So I'm going to put the first group. Do you guys hear me? We have 20 participants. So we have 5 participants in each group. I'm going to make 5 different groups, 5 different rooms, I mean. And
can I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah.
Am I able to stop sharing the screen now?
Yeah. I can. No, don't stop it, because we need your questions.
Okay.
So
I'll have to leave it like this then.
So the first group, I'm gonna give. Can you give me the question for the first?
So I guess I'll just use my question. Can you distinguish the difference between abuse and tough love?
Abuse versus tough love. Second group will be called.
The second question is, what are some effective ways to discipline a child without being abusive or violent?
Child disciplining group. Then the next group, group number 3, will be called.
The question is, what is the best way to protect your child from a toxic and violent environment?
And then the next group will be called.
What are some signs that a child may showcase to outsiders that would indicate that they are being abused?
Yeah, I had.
Basically, what are the signs?
Yeah, and the last one?
That was the last one.
That was the last one? Okay.
Yeah, the 4 questions.
Okay, good. So I'm going to delete this group and delete breakout group. Yes. So now we have open all rooms, and I'm going to assign you. Yep.
What happened?
I'm going to assign you guys too. So you will be the leaders to talk, and I will close the rooms, and then we're going to come back. So I'm going to assign you and assign you. Good? You all good?
What just happened?
Oh, you got kicked out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody got kicked out?
Yeah.
We got kicked out.
Okay, let's do it again.
Round 2.
I randomly got the poll out of nowhere.
I got the poll.
Yeah,
guys
I just
are
got
all
the
back?
poll.
It didn't
The
work.
poll.
I'm gonna put you back. Okay, I'm gonna Move to child discipline.
We're still recording, right?
You're still recording, yeah. I'm gonna stop the recording.